Hello, everyone. We're going to be starting a new unit on cellular respiration, which is an extremely important process in your body where we're taking the food that we eat and we're pretty much breaking it down to get energy to be able to do things like your fun exercises after school. So, this 6.1 to 6.6 is just an overview, which we'll go over. Um, so, we'll be talking about photosynthesis in our next unit, but it's just important to remember the relationship between cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Um, in cellular respiration, which is what we're going to be talking about this unit, we have sugar and oxygen, and those are our reactants, which we break down to form energy. The point of cellular respiration is to get energy. So we're taking sugar, we break it down to get energy, and the products that are formed is CO2 and H2O, carbon dioxide, and water. Um, in photosynthesis, it's the exact opposite, where you're starting off with CO2 and water, and you're using light energy, so you're using energy in order to form sugar. And so just remember that relationship, that they're very closely related. Okay, in 6.2, the big key idea here is that respiration, which is breathing, is not the same thing as cellular respiration. And so, in regular breathing, you're just exchanging the oxygen that you're taking in with the CO2 that you're releasing. It's just an exchange of gas. Whereas in cellular respiration, that oxygen that you're breathing in can be used to break down molecules. So the main idea here is that cellular respiration is the breaking down of molecules to get energy. And so the relationship between breathing and cellular respiration is very important because cellular respiration is aerobic, which means that it requires oxygen, and it needs that oxygen that you get from breathing. In terms of a general overview of what's happening in cellular respiration, you start off with a glucose molecule, and you're eventually going to form 32 ATP molecules. So this is our final goal, is to get a lot of this kind of energy. In the process, you're going to be using oxygen to be able to break down the glucose, and you're eventually going to form carbon dioxide and water, and those are our byproducts of the reaction. So how do we get energy from glucose? The big idea is that you're actually using a transfer of electrons through a series of different chemical reactions. So you take your glucose molecule and you're essentially ripping electrons off of it, and when you take those electrons off, you're allowing the energy to eventually be released, and that energy released is going to be used to form ATP. So it's important to know what redox reactions are, or oxidation reduction reactions, and that's simply a type of reaction where electrons are being transferred. You should know these two terms right here. Oxidation is when you lose electrons, and reduction is when you gain electrons. And the way I remember it is reduction refers to the reduction in charge. So your charge gets lower because you're gaining electrons. So even though you're gaining electrons, think of reduce, like reducing charge. This right here is important to know. You should know that glucose is what's being oxidized, which means that we're taking the glucose molecule and we're ripping the electrons off. It's losing electrons. And that oxygen right here is what's being reduced, or it's the one that's receiving electrons. So at the end of the day, this oxygen is eventually going to be getting the electrons from the glucose. And that process of taking electrons from glucose and putting on oxygen is what releases a lot of energy that we can use to make ATP. Okay, so for this to happen, to get electrons from glucose all the way to oxygen, you need something called electron carriers, which are coenzymes that are used to help transport the electrons. There are two important coenzymes that you need to know. One of them is called NAD+, and when it gains 2 electrons, it becomes NADH. So this form, NADH, is when it's carrying the electrons. In the same way, FAD is something that is just another electron carrier. It becomes FADH2, and that's when it's carrying the 2 electrons. So these two forms here, when it has the hydrogen atoms on it, is when it's carrying electrons. Essentially what's happening is, as electrons are being ripped off of glucose, they get attached to the NAD+, which becomes NADH, and they get a part of the electron carriers, and the electron carriers eventually go to something called the electron transport chain, which we'll talk about later. And these carriers pretty much drop off the electrons, and the electrons go through this cascade of different proteins. They keep on falling down, and they're jumping from protein to protein. And as they do that, a lot of this energy is released, and the energy that's released forms ATP. And the electrons eventually they go through this cascade of proteins, and at the very end they get finally received by oxygen, therefore reducing oxygen. And when it does that, it forms water. Okay, there are three major stages of cellular respiration. Glycolysis is the first stage. The second stage is the citric acid cycle and pyruvate oxidation. And the last stage is oxidative phosphorylation. Those are our three stages inside a eukaryotic cell. Remember, prokaryotic cells don't have mitochondria. So these two stages, which occur inside the mitochondria, cannot occur in a prokaryotic cell. Prokaryotic cells can only do glycolysis, which happens in the cytoplasm. I'm going to go over really briefly what each of these stages look like, and that will be the end for this lecture. So the first stage is glycolysis. Like we mentioned, it happens in the cytosol, or the cytoplasm. So it doesn't happen inside of mitochondria. It also does not require oxygen. It's a very basic, you're taking glucose and you simply take this 6-carbon sugar and you're breaking it pretty much in half, where you get two things called pyruvates, and pyruvate is just a 3-carbon sugar. So you're taking the 6-carbon sugar, glucose, breaking it in half, and you get 2 pyruvates. That's what happens in glycolysis. In pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle, the second stage, this is occurring inside the mitochondria, inside the mitochondrial matrix. Remember, that's the inner part of the mitochondria. It's aerobic, which means it does require oxygen. And you're pretty much taking the products of glycolysis, which is pyruvate, and you're breaking it down into CO2. So because pyruvate is 3 carbons, you're going to eventually form 3 CO2s for every 1 pyruvate. The point of stage 1 and 2, you do generate a little bit of ATP in both of these stages, but the big idea for stage 1 and 2 is you're creating a lot of those electron carriers, NADH and FADH2. So you're pretty much taking all the electrons off of glucose and you're storing them in these electron carriers, and they're eventually going to bring it into stage 3. Stage 3 is called oxidative phosphorylation. And in oxidative phosphorylation, it uses two things called the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis to form ATP. This is the most important stage in terms of the most amount of ATP is made in stage 3. These two terms you should know, electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. What happens is those electron carriers that were produced in stage 1 and stage 2, they donate the electrons to the electron transport chain, which as electrons are falling, it pumps a bunch of protons into the intermembrane space. Remember, that's the space between the inner membrane of the mitochondria and the outer membrane of the mitochondria. So that little space between the two membranes stores a lot of protons, and that creates something called a concentration gradient of protons, where there's a lot of protons inside there, but not very many proton concentration inside the mitochondria. And so that buildup of protons in the intermembrane space creates a lot of potential energy because those protons really want to come back. And as soon as those protons shoot back into the mitochondria, that helps make the ATP. So we'll go through all of these 3 different stages much more in depth as we finish chapter 6, but this is kind of just a broad overview of what will be happening in cellular respiration.